They told her she was digging her own grave. In a way, they were right, except it turned out to be everyone else's salvation. Montana Territory, autumn of 1887. The morning air carried the smell of dying leaves and frozen earth, that particular scent that tells anyone who has survived a northern winter that time is running out. Eleanor Dawson drove her pickaxe into the hillside behind the abandoned mining claim and felt the shock travel up through her arms, through her shoulders, into the base of her skull. The rock beneath the soil rang like a bell struck wrong. She pulled the axe free, swung again. The hill resisted the way the world had been resisting her for the past 6 months, and like every other time, she refused to stop. Rusty lay 10 feet behind her, his golden coat dusted with fallen leaves, his brown eyes following every swing with the patient attention of a creature who has decided that wherever his human goes, he will go too. His tail swept the ground in slow, methodical arcs, brushing aside leaves that the wind kept pushing back. He had been Thomas's dog first. Now he was hers. That was how things worked when someone died. The living inherited not just property and debt, but love that had nowhere else to go. She was 4 swings into her rhythm when she heard the horse. Samuel Harlan, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and considered this fact sufficient qualification to offer opinions on everything, rode up on his bay mare and sat watching her for a full 10 minutes before speaking. Ellie knew he was there. She could hear the horse breathing, could feel Harlan's gaze on her back like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. She kept swinging. Let him watch. Let them all watch. "You know there's no gold in that hill," he finally said. "Prospectors checked it years ago. Nothing but clay and rock." Ellie didn't stop. "I'm not looking for gold." "Then what are you doing?" "Building a home." The laugh came exactly as she'd expected it. Sharp, dismissive, the kind of laugh that men produced when they encountered something that didn't fit inside the small box of their understanding. Rusty raised his head and growled a low sound deep in his chest, and Harlan's horse shifted sideways. "A home in a hill. Ma'am, with respect, your husband left you that cabin not 200 yards from here. 4 walls, a roof, a fireplace. What more does a woman need?" Ellie stopped swinging. She turned and looked at Wade Harlan with eyes that had spent 6 months staring at things most people looked away from. The inside of an empty cabin at 3 in the morning. The place in a bed where a body used to be. The expression on a banker's face when he explains to a widow that her husband's debts now belong to her. "My husband is dead, Mr. Harlan. The cabin he built has walls so thin I can hear the wind laughing at me through every crack. Last winter I burned every stick of furniture we owned just to keep from freezing, and I still woke up with ice in my hair." She held his gaze. "This winter I'm going to sleep warm, and I'm going to do it underground where the cold can't reach me." Harlan shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've decided a woman has lost her mind, and there's no point in arguing. He gathered his reins, then paused as if remembering something. "One more thing, Mrs. Dawson. Judge Whitfield was asking about your land last week. Said mining claim rights need to be used for their proper purpose within 12 months, or the county takes them back." He looked at her not unkindly, but with the detached concern of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. "I don't know the law, but you should know people are paying attention." He rode away without looking back. Ellie stood holding her pickaxe, sweat cooling on her skin. Harlan's words settling into her like stones dropped into still water. Whitfield. The name carried weight in this valley the way a storm cloud carries rain. She filed it away, picked up her axe, and swung again. The hill opened 1 inch at a time. Thomas Dawson had died in April, 3 days after the spring thaw revealed his body at the bottom of Crane's Ravine, where he'd fallen while checking trap lines in February. The search parties had given up after 2 weeks. The snow had been too deep, the terrain too treacherous, the odds too long. 20 men had volunteered for the search. By day 10, only 3 were still looking. Ellie had known he was dead by the end of the first week. She'd felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not through any specific sense, but through all of them at once, a shifting in the quality of the air, a heaviness that had nothing to do with weather. But she'd kept a candle burning in the window every night until the melt came, and 2 hunters found what was left of him wedged between rocks 40 feet below the trail he'd walked 100 times before. The funeral was brief. Reverend Moss spoke for 8 minutes about the fragility of life and the certainty of God's plan. Ellie sat in the front pew and thought about Thomas's hands. They had been large, rough with calluses, and always warm. On winter mornings before leaving the cabin, he would take her hands in his and hold them until the warmth transferred. Keep my heat till I get back, he'd say. It had been their ritual, their small daily covenant against the cold. He hadn't come back, and her hands hadn't been warm since. By May, the town had moved on to other concerns. Ellie was left alone with a cabin that leaked a dog that mourned and a piece of land nobody wanted because it was too far from water and too close to the mountains where the worst weather came from. She could have sold the claim and moved to town, could have found work as a seamstress or a cook or a laundress, could have traded her independence for the security of walls that someone else maintained. The respectable widows did this. The sensible widows did this. Ellie was tired of being sensible. Being sensible had meant not arguing when Thomas said he'd be fine checking those traps alone. Being sensible had meant trusting that a man who'd walked that trail 100 times could walk it 101. She had grown up in a mining family in Cornwall, England, where her father and 3 brothers spent their lives crawling through tunnels carved into the earth beneath the moors. She remembered the kitchen table on winter evenings, her father's face black with dust, his voice rough but alive as he described the world beneath the surface. Down in the deep shafts, he told them the temperature never changed. Cool in summer when the surface baked, warm in winter when the fields froze solid. Storms could tear the roofs off houses and flatten barns and kill livestock in the open pastures, but 200 feet below, a man could work in his shirt sleeves and never know. She had been 12 when her father first took her into the mine. Not deep, just the first 100 yards of the main shaft where the ceiling was high enough to stand and the walls glistened with moisture that caught her lantern light like scattered diamonds. She remembered the feeling with perfect clarity even now, 19 years later. The silence, the stillness, the strange absolute comfort of being wrapped in earth while the November wind howled impotently above. She had been 14 when the mine took him back. The collapse happened on a Tuesday during the afternoon shift. A support timber cracked, then another, and then 30 feet of tunnel ceiling came down like the fist of God and buried 4 men under 1,000 tons of Cornish clay. They recovered 3 of the bodies. Her father's was the one they never found. The family sailed for America 6 weeks later. Her mother never spoke of the mine again. Her brothers found work above ground and swore they'd never go below. And Ellie carried 2 truths inside her that pulled in opposite directions like horses hitched to the same post. The earth could save you. The earth could kill you. Both things were real. Both things were true. Thomas had laughed when she suggested building a root cellar their first year on the claim. "We're not moles, Ellie. We're people. People live above ground." He'd kissed the top of her head the way he did when he found her charming and wrong at the same time. She'd let it go. She'd let a lot of things go with Thomas because he was kind, because he was warm, and because arguing with a man who was certain he was right was like arguing with weather. But Thomas was dead, and the cabin he'd been so certain about had nearly killed her last winter. She spent the summer preparing. She read every book about mining and excavation that the Territorial Library possessed, all 3 of them, their pages soft with age and spotted with the fingerprints of men who'd come before her looking for different treasures. She bought whiskey for old prospectors in town and sat on barrel tops outside the general store, listening to them talk about shoring angles and ventilation shafts and the behavior of water underground. One prospector, a man named Judd who had lost 3 fingers to a drilling accident and walked with the permanent lean of someone whose spine had been rearranged by decades of stooping in low tunnels, told her the most important thing anyone said all summer. "The earth don't lie to you, ma'am. People lie, weather lies. But the earth is what it is. You learn to read it, you learn to trust it. It'll tell you where it's strong and where it's weak. All you have to do is listen." She listened. She walked the hillside for weeks, studying the drainage patterns after rain, digging test holes with a hand spade to check the soil composition at different depths, pressing the earth between her fingers and smelling it the way her father had taught her. Clay smelled different from loam. Rock dust smelled different from sand. The earth told you what it was if you paid attention. She found the spot in late August, a south-facing section of the hillside where the drainage flowed naturally away from the slope, where the test holes showed dense clay beginning at 4.5 feet, where the angle of the hill would give her enough earth above the chamber for insulation without so much weight that the ceiling would be under constant stress. She marked it with a stake and a strip of red cloth from one of Thomas's old shirts. Standing there looking at the small flag snapping in the late summer breeze, she felt something that might have been hope, or might have been terror. With things this big, the 2 felt nearly identical. When the leaves began to turn, she started digging. The first 3 feet were the worst. Topsoil laced with roots thick as her wrist, studded with rocks the size of her head, each one requiring an hour of prying and levering and cursing to remove. Her hands blistered on the first day. The blisters broke on the second. By the third day, she was wrapping her palms in strips torn from an old petticoat, the cotton turning brown with dried blood by noon and needing replacement by evening. Her shoulders burned. Her back seized twice, locking her into a bent position that she could only release by lying flat on the cold ground and waiting for the muscles to unknot. She kept going. By the end of the first week, she'd carved a horizontal gash into the hillside about 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. It looked, she had to admit, exactly like what the neighbors thought it was. A crazy woman's hole in a hill. But she knew what lay ahead. She'd felt it in the test holes. Dense blue-gray clay starting at about 5 feet, in the kind that held its shape when you carved it, that compressed under its own weight instead of crumbling, that sealed against water like natural mortar. Her father had called it miner's friend. She just had to get through the rock and roots to reach it. The neighbors came. They rode by more frequently than before, finding excuses to check on her, really coming to witness the spectacle. Each one had a prediction. Each one was certain. Agnes Pruitt arrived first carrying a plate of cornbread that she held out like a peace offering while her eyes devoured every detail of the excavation. Agnes lived 3 miles east and ran the valley's informal news service through sheer force of will and an inability to keep any observation to herself. She stayed for 20 minutes, asked 7 questions, touched the soil with one finger, as if checking for fever, and left. By nightfall, Ellie knew every family within 10 miles would have a detailed account of the crazy widow's hole, each retelling a little more dramatic than the last. Henrik Pruitt came the next day without cornbread. Agnes's husband was a practical man in the way that small, cautious men are practical. He looked at the excavation, looked at Ellie, and made an offer. $40 for the claim. You take that money, move to town, find yourself a room at the boarding house. Live like a civilized person. Ellie leaned on her pickaxe. My land isn't for sale, Mr. Pruitt. It's not land, Mrs. Dawson. It's a mining claim. And you're not mining. He said this with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he's identified a flaw in someone else's logic. $40 is more than fair for acreage this far from water. The answer is no. Henrik Pruitt left with the tight jaw of a man who has been denied a bargain he felt entitled to. Ellie watched him go and felt something shift inside her. Henrik hadn't come out of concern. He'd come because he smelled opportunity in her desperation. A widow alone digging a hole, clearly losing her mind. Easy pickings. She swung the pickaxe harder after that. Young Billy Fenton came on the third day riding out from the Harlan Ranch where he worked as a hand. 19 years old with the gangly limbs and permanent sunburn of a boy raised on horseback. Billy didn't offer predictions or money. He sat on a rock and watched her work with an expression of genuine fascination. My pa tried to dig a well once, he said. Hit granite at 8 feet, broke 2 pickaxes, gave up. I'm not digging a well, Ellie said. I know, whole valley's talking about it. He paused. What's it like, the digging, I mean? Nobody had asked her that before. Slow, she said, painful, and every inch feels like winning a war. Billy nodded as if this made perfect sense to him and rode away. Of all her visitors, he was the only one who came back the next day just to see how much further she'd gotten. It was on the 8th day near sunset that the stranger appeared. Ellie was deep enough now that she had to toss the loose soil out of the excavation in buckets, a process that doubled the time for every foot of progress. She was hauling a full bucket up the slope when she noticed a man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He was perhaps 33, with the weathered face and scarred hands of someone who had spent years doing physical work that didn't pay well enough to keep his clothes mended. His shirt was wrinkled, his boots were cracked, and he smelled, even from 10 feet away, of whiskey. Not the fresh smell of a drink recently taken, but the deep, settled smell of a man for whom whiskey had become less a choice than a climate. But his eyes were steady, and they moved over her excavation with the practiced attention of a professional. He watched her swing the pickaxe 3 times, then spoke. You're at the wrong angle. Tilt your swing about 15 degrees to the left. Let the weight of the head do the work instead of your shoulders. You'll cut your effort in half. Ellie stopped. Who are you? Dalton Schaefer, miner, or I was before the company went belly up. He stepped closer, examining the exposed soil face of her excavation. You've got good clay coming in at about 5 feet. Another foot and you'll be in solid material. That's where the real work starts, but it's also where the structure starts holding itself. I didn't ask for advice. No, you didn't. He looked at her, not the way Harlan had looked or Henrik Pruitt or Agnes. He looked at her the way one craftsman looks at another's work, assessing, evaluating, and beneath the whiskey haze something that might have been respect. I could help. I work cheap. I can't afford cheap. I can't afford anything. Dalton Schaefer shrugged, shoved his hands in his pockets, and walked away into the fading light. Rusty watched him go, then looked at Ellie, then put his head back down on his paws. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the excavation to find that 3 large rocks she'd been planning to remove, each one the size of a flour barrel, and wedged into the left wall of the entrance, had been dug out and rolled to the side. The work was clean, professional, the kind of extraction that left the surrounding soil undisturbed, that didn't compromise the structural integrity of the face. No one had seen who did it. Rusty, who slept in the cabin with Ellie and would have barked at any nighttime visitor, had apparently made an exception. Ellie stared at the cleared rocks for a long time, then picked up her axe and kept digging. The second week brought the clay, and the clay changed everything. It was dense, blue-gray, ancient. It smelled of deep water and long patience of earth that had been compressed by the weight of millennia into something almost like stone, but more forgiving. When Ellie carved into it, the walls held their shape. The ceiling didn't crumble. The material packed against itself, creating surfaces that were smooth and solid, and she realized with a surge of something close to joy exactly what she needed. She began to shape the space with intention now. The entrance tunnel stayed narrow, just wide enough for her shoulders angled slightly upward from outside to inside, so that water would drain out rather than pooling in the main chamber. Past the entrance, she started to widen, carving an oval room that would eventually be 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the center. Big enough to live in, big enough to survive in. The work changed character once she was inside the clay. On the surface, digging had been a fight. Every swing met resistance that felt personal, as if the earth actively opposed her presence. But inside the clay layer, the pickaxe moved differently. It bit clean, released clean, left surfaces that held their edges the way good bread holds its shape when sliced. She developed a rhythm, 3 swings to loosen a section, then hands to pull the loosened clay free and pack it into the bucket. Swing, 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 pull. Swing, 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 pull. The rhythm became a clock, and the clock became a companion, filling the silence that would otherwise have been unbearable. She carried each bucket to the surface and dumped it on the growing mound beside the entrance. 47 buckets the first day in the clay. She counted because counting gave the work a structure that raw endurance couldn't provide, and because each number was a small victory that the next number could build on. At night, she returned to the cabin where the wind found its way through gaps that Thomas had always meant to seal and never had. She heated water on the stove, soaked her hands until the cracked skin softened enough to move without bleeding, then wrapped them in clean cloth and lay on the bed with Rusty curled against her legs. The dog's warmth was the only warmth in the cabin that didn't come from fire. And on the coldest nights, it was the difference between sleeping and lying awake, listening to her own teeth chatter. She talked to Thomas in the dark sometimes. Not prayers, not conversations, just statements directed at the empty space where he should have been. I got another 2 feet today. Or, the clay smells like the mines in Penwith. Or simply, I miss you, spoken to the ceiling, to the leaking roof, to the wind that carried her words away before they could settle anywhere. Rusty always lifted his head when she spoke, always looked at her with those patient brown eyes, always put his head back down without judgment. He was the only audience she needed. By the end of the second week, the oval chamber was taking shape. She could stand upright in the center and stretch her arms without touching the walls. The space had presence now, the particular gravity of an enclosed room that changes the quality of sound and light in a breath. When she lit a candle inside and stood at the entrance looking in, it looked less like a hole and more like a possibility. The shoring came next. She'd traded 3 months of butter and eggs to the sawmill owner for a stack of pine logs, and she spent 4 days cutting them to length with a cross-cut saw and fitting them into place. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls. Horizontal beams across the ceiling, notched at each end to lock into the posts like the interlocking fingers of clasped hands. The frame would hold even if the earth decided to settle, even if the weight above shifted, even if the worst happened. She was fitting the 5th ceiling beam when it happened. The crack was sudden, loud, a sound like a rifle shot in the enclosed space. The beam she'd just placed split along a hidden flaw, a hairline fracture invisible on the surface, and dropped 6 inches before the neighboring beams caught the load. Soil rained down, dust filled the air, and Ellie stood directly beneath, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her mind suddenly 15,000 miles and 17 years away, standing in a kitchen in Cornwall, while her mother screamed and a neighbor said the words, "Cave in," and 4 men and we can't reach them. Rusty barked from the entrance. The sound cut through the memory like a blade through rope. Ellie gasped, sucked in dust, coughed, and forced her hands to move. She braced the sagging section with a spare timber, working by feel because her eyes were streaming, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She worked for 3 hours without stopping, removing the cracked beam, selecting a new one, testing it by striking it with a mallet, and listening to the sound. Her father had taught her this too. Good wood rang bright and sharp. Cracked wood answered with a flat thud, the sound of something broken, pretending to be whole. When the repair was done, she crawled out of the tunnel and sat on the hillside with her arms wrapped around Rusty's neck and shook. Not from cold, not from exhaustion, from the pure animal terror of a woman who has just stood in her father's grave and climbed back out. After that night, there was a hesitation, 2 seconds every time she entered the tunnel, 2 seconds where her feet stopped moving and her breath caught, and every instinct screamed at her to turn around, go back to the leaking cabin, accept the cold, accept the ice in her hair, accept the slow grinding death of a life lived on the surface, where at least the sky couldn't fall on her. 2 seconds, then she stepped forward. Nobody saw those 2 seconds, nobody knew they existed, but they were there every time, and every time she walked through them. Dalton Schaefer came back 3 days after the beam incident. Sober this time, or at least more sober, with a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He ducked into the entrance without asking permission, examined the repaired beam, ran his fingers along the joint where new wood met old, and came back out. "You fixed it right," he said, "but there's a trick for catching bad wood before you install it. Tap it with your knuckle. Good timber sounds like a knock on a door. Rotten timber sounds like a knock on a coffin." "Why are you helping me?" Ellie asked. "You moved those rocks last week." "Don't bother denying it." Dalton was quiet for a long time. He looked at the tunnel entrance, at the pile of excavated earth, at the tools leaning against the hillside. Then he looked at something that wasn't there. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. "My daughter's name was Lily. 4 years old. They both died 3 winters ago, diphtheria." He said the word the way you say the name of a place you can never return to. "I couldn't save them. Couldn't build them anything that would have helped. Couldn't do anything except stand there and watch." He turned to Ellie. "You don't stand there, you dig." Ellie said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the silence. From that day, she didn't send him away when he appeared at the hillside. He came inconsistently, some days sharp and useful, some days reeking of whiskey, and moving with the careful precision of a man trying to pretend he's steady. On those days, Ellie told him to go home. He never argued. He just left and came back the next day or the day after, and they never discussed the gap. It was during one of Dalton's sober days that he told her something that changed the shape of her understanding. They were sitting at the tunnel entrance, eating cold biscuits, when he said almost casually, "Whitfield isn't a bad man, you know." Ellie looked at him. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but he organized the collection when the diphtheria came through, raised money for medicine, wrote to the territorial governor for help." Dalton chewed slowly. "He follows the law because he believes in the law. Problem is the law wasn't written for people like you." Before Ellie could respond, the sound of wheels on the trail silenced them both. A black carriage pulled by a single gray horse stopped at the base of the hill. The man who stepped out was tall, thin, dressed in a dark vest over a white shirt, carrying a leather case with the gravity of a man carrying scripture. His face was not cruel. It was ordered, every feature in its proper place, every expression measured and intentional, the face of a man who had organized his entire existence around the principle that rules exist for good reasons and people who follow them prosper. Judge Horace Whitfield climbed the slope with careful steps and stopped 10 feet from the tunnel entrance. He looked at the excavation, at the timber frame visible inside, at the pile of tools and the stack of pine logs. Then he looked at Ellie. "Mrs. Dawson, I'm here in my capacity as Justice of the Peace." His voice was neither warm nor cold. It was the voice of a document being read aloud. This land is registered as a mining claim under your late husband's name. Under territorial law, mining claims must be actively worked for their stated purpose within 12 months, or they revert to county control. I'm not mining, Judge Whitfield. I'm building a residence. I can see that, but the law doesn't distinguish between intentions, Mrs. Dawson. It distinguishes between categories. This land is categorized as a mining claim. You are not mining. The law is clear. He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone softened in a way that made it worse because the softness was genuine. I would strongly advise you to sell this property and relocate to town. A woman alone this far out before winter. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. How long do I have? Whitfield opened his leather case and produced a document. I'm giving you 60 days to demonstrate that this land is being used for a legally recognized purpose. Residential construction may qualify under certain provisions of the Homestead Act, but the burden of proof is on you. If you cannot demonstrate legitimate residential use by the end of November, I will be obligated to sign an order of reversion. He handed her the document. Their fingers didn't touch. He walked back to his carriage with the same careful steps, climbed in, and drove away. Ellie stood holding the paper, reading the precise legal language that said, in as many words, that she had 60 days to prove she had a right to exist in the place she'd chosen to exist. 60 days to turn a hole in a hill into something a judge would recognize as a home. 60 days before the law, written by men who'd never spent a winter with ice in their hair, decided she didn't belong here. Rusty pressed his head against her leg. Dalton, still sitting at the tunnel entrance, said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying the first real bite of autumn cold, the kind that promises worse to come. Ellie folded the document, put it in her pocket, picked up her pickaxe, and went back inside the hill. The clock was running, 60 days, and winter was already sharpening its teeth on the mountaintops above. 43 days. That was what remained when Ellie and Dalton began building the fireplace, and the number sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, constant and urgent, counting down toward a deadline that didn't care whether she was ready or not. The fireplace was the last major structure the shelter needed to qualify as something a judge might call a home. Everything else was in place. The oval chamber with its timbered frame, the plank flooring she'd laid over, packed earth, the shelves carved into the clay walls where she'd begun stacking provisions. But without a fireplace, without heat, it was still just a cave. And Whitfield would call it exactly that. Dalton arrived sober on the morning they started, carrying a canvas sack of flat stones he'd collected from the creek bed over the previous week. He dumped them at the tunnel entrance without ceremony and said, "These will do for the firebox. Riverstone holds heat longer than quarried rock. Doesn't crack as easy either." They worked together in the back of the chamber building, the fireplace against the rear wall, stone by stone, fitting each piece with clay mortar that Ellie mixed by hand in a wooden bucket. The chimney was the critical part. It had to rise through 8 feet of earth at an angle steep enough to draw smoke upward, but shallow enough to prevent rain and snow from falling straight in. The design came from the old Cornish mine ventilation systems, where angled shafts kept air moving through hundreds of feet of tunnel without mechanical assistance. The physics were simple. Hot air rises. Give it a path, and it will follow that path with the reliability of water running downhill. Angle the path, and you create a natural draft that pulls fresh air in from the entrance and pushes stale air and smoke out through the top. It was elegant, ancient engineering invented by men who couldn't read but understood the behavior of air and fire with an intimacy that no textbook could replicate. They built the chimney in 2 days, lining the shaft with flat stones and sealing the joints with clay. When they finished, Ellie gathered kindling, arranged it in the small firebox, struck a match, and held her breath. The flame caught. Smoke curled upward, hesitated at the chimney mouth as if deciding whether to cooperate, then rose steadily into the shaft and disappeared. No backdraft, no pooling, just a clean vertical pull that drew the smoke up and away exactly as the design promised. 5 minutes later, standing outside on the hillside, Ellie looked up and saw a thin thread of white rising from the earth 20 feet above the tunnel entrance. The hill was breathing, a faint line of smoke against the gray October sky, barely visible, easily mistaken for mist. But it was real. It was proof. The shelter had lungs now. Dalton stood beside her, watching the smoke with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something between satisfaction and grief, the look of a man remembering what it felt like to build something that worked. Looks like the hill's alive, he said quietly. Ellie almost laughed. It came up through her chest unexpectedly, like a bubble breaking the surface of still water, and she caught it just before it escaped. It would have been the first time she'd laughed since Thomas died. She wasn't ready for that yet, but she noted the feeling, filed it away, proof that something inside her was thawing too. That same week, Wade Harlan rode out again. This time there was no smirk, no condescension. His face carried the particular tightness of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. Whitfield rode to the territorial court in Helena, he said without dismounting, asking for a legal opinion on your claim status. If Helena backs him, it won't matter what you build down there. He'll have authority to sign the reversion order anytime. Ellie's hands went still on the pickaxe she'd been sharpening. Why are you telling me this? Harlan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley below. The Pruitt farm was visible to the east, its buildings small and vulnerable against the enormity of the landscape. His own ranch lay to the south, prosperous and sprawling, but even at this distance, Ellie could see the gap in the fence line where two calves had frozen to death during last week's early cold snap. Animals that should have been safe for another month. Animals that died because the cold had come faster than anyone expected. I lost two calves last week, he said, froze overnight in a pasture I've used for 20 years. Never lost an animal there before October. He looked at her. I'm starting to think you might know something the rest of us don't. He didn't apologize, didn't say he'd been wrong, but he'd ridden 3 miles to deliver a warning he could have kept to himself, and for Wade Harlan, that was as close to an olive branch as a man like him could manage. After he left, Ellie sat in the entrance of her tunnel and calculated. If Helena responded quickly, she might have weeks instead of days. If they responded slowly, the 60-day deadline still held. Either way, the window was closing, and the only thing she could control was the work. She worked faster. October turned, and the valley began to suffer. The early frost that had killed Harlan's calves was just the beginning. The Pruitt root cellar flooded after 3 days of cold rain, the water seeping in through cracks that Henrik had never bothered to seal, ruining half their stored vegetables for winter. Ellie heard about it from Billy Fenton, who rode by with the regularity of a title schedule, now bringing gossip and taking away stories he'd retell at the Harlan Ranch bunkhouse. The Fenton's well finally hit water. Billy reported one afternoon sitting on his usual rock, while Ellie packed clay between the ceiling beams inside. But it tastes like pennies. Pa says there's some kind of mineral down there. Undrinkable. Spent 4 months digging for water he can't use. Billy watched her work for a while, his chin resting on his knee. He had stopped asking questions about what she was building. Now he asked questions about how. How did she know which clay would hold? How did she decide the angle of the entrance? How did she keep the air from going stale? Each question revealed a mind that was hungrier than his circumstances had allowed it to be, a 19-year-old ranch hand who should have been in a school somewhere, learning things that mattered, instead of chasing cattle across frozen pastures for a man who paid him barely enough to eat. You ever think about building one of these yourself? Ellie asked him once. Billy laughed, the open, uncomplicated laugh of someone who hasn't yet learned to hide what he feels. I don't own any land, Mrs. Dawson. Don't own much of anything, truth be told. You own a pair of hands and a brain that works. That's more than most of the people telling me I'm crazy. He rode away with a thoughtful expression that afternoon, and Ellie found herself hoping that whatever happened next, Billy Fenton would land somewhere that deserved him. Meanwhile, inside the hill, everything held. It was late October when Harlan came to see the inside for the first time. He stood at the tunnel entrance with his hat in his hands, peering into the darkness, the way a man peers into a well, as if he expects something to peer back. Ellie handed him a lantern. Mind your head at the entrance. Opens up once you're past the first section. He ducked through and disappeared. She could hear his boots on the plank floor, his breathing echoing off the curved walls, the small sounds a large man makes in an unfamiliar space. Then silence. A long silence that stretched until Ellie began to wonder if something was wrong. Good Lord! His voice came back muffled, hollowed by earth. When he emerged, the change was visible. The skepticism that had lived in his face since the first day, the faint amusement at the edges of his mouth, the slight elevation of his eyebrows that said he was tolerating foolishness out of neighborly obligation, all of it was gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest. It's warm in there, he said. Must be 15-20 degrees warmer than out here. 55 degrees, year-round at this depth. Harlan stared at her. You build a fireplace, underground. The chimney vents through the hillside. I could show you the diagrams if you're interested. Mrs. Dawson, He put his hat back on, adjusted it, took it off again. A man wrestling with words he wasn't accustomed to saying. I owe you an apology. When you started this, I thought... He stopped. I was wrong. This is something else entirely. He rode away slowly, looking back twice before he disappeared around the bend. Ellie permitted herself a small nod. Then she went back inside to finish installing the bed frame she'd been working on. There was no time for satisfaction. Satisfaction was a luxury that came after the deadline, if the deadline didn't come for her first. November arrived carrying snow on its shoulders, and the snow brought visitors of a different kind. Agnes Pruitt appeared first, her earlier role as the Valley's chief gossip conveniently forgotten, asking if Ellie might share the plans for the ventilation system. The Pruitt farmhouse chimney had collapsed under the weight of wet snow, and the family was burning fires in the kitchen stove with all the windows cracked open, filling the house with cold air to keep from filling it with smoke. Ellie handed over the diagrams without comment. Agnes took them, glanced at Ellie, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and left. Whatever she'd been about to say, whether it was thanks or apology or explanation, died somewhere between intention and utterance. Henrik came the next day, hat in hand for the first time in Ellie's memory, asking to buy firewood. Their own supply had gotten wet when the woodshed roof leaked, and wet wood produced more smoke than heat, a slow suffocation disguised as warmth. Ellie sold him what she could spare at a fair price. She didn't mention his offer to buy her land for $40. She didn't need to. The fact that he was standing at her door needing what she had said everything that needed saying. Then came the day that changed everything, though Ellie didn't know it yet. The courtroom in town was a single room above the general store, accessible by an exterior staircase that groaned under the weight of anyone heavier than a child. 12 wooden chairs faced a raised desk where Judge Whitfield sat with the legal documents arranged before him in precise rows, each paper aligned with its neighbor, as if even the angles of paper corners were subject to his sense of order. Ellie arrived alone. She wore her cleanest dress, which was not very clean, and carried a rolled bundle of papers under her arm. Her hands were still rough and scarred from the digging, the skin cracked along the knuckles, the nails broken short. She did not try to hide them. The room was half full. Agnes and Henrik Pruitt sat near the back. Billy Fenton leaned against the wall by the door, too restless to sit. A clerk from the territorial land office in Helena sat to Whitfield's left, a thin man with spectacles and the permanently exhausted expression of someone who spent his life reading documents nobody else cared about. Ruth Adler, who owned the general store below and had presumably walked up the stairs from her own shop, sat in the last row with her hands folded in her lap. And Wade Harlan, who Ellie had not expected, occupied a chair in the middle of the room with his legs stretched out and his hat on his knee. Whitfield called the proceeding to order with a single tap of his knuckle on the desk. This hearing concerns the land use status of the mining claim registered to the late Thomas Dawson, currently occupied by his widow Eleanor Dawson. He spoke without notes, the facts arranged in his memory with the same precision as the papers on his desk. Under Section 7 of the Territorial Land Code, mining claims must be actively developed or for mineral extraction within 12 months of registration or face reversion to county control. Mr. Dawson registered this claim 14 months ago. No mining activity has been conducted. Mrs. Dawson has instead undertaken construction of a subterranean structure whose purpose is in dispute. He turned to the Helena clerk. Mr. Farnham, your assessment. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. The law is specific, oh, Your Honor. Mining claim rights exist in a separate legal framework from homestead rights. The Homestead Act permits residential development on agricultural land, but mining claims carry different obligations and different protections. The distinction is categorical, not interpretive. Whitfield nodded and turned to Ellie. Mrs. Dawson, you may present your case. Ellie stood. She unrolled her papers on the table nearest the judge's desk and spread them flat. Floor plans, cross-sections, the chimney design, measurements and annotations in her own handwriting, precise and unadorned. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. She had expected them to shake. She had expected to feel small in this room full of people who had watched her dig and judged her and talked about her behind closed doors and over supper tables for months. But standing here now with the evidence of her work spread out in front of her, she felt something she hadn't expected. Certainty, not the brittle certainty of someone who has convinced herself she's right, but the deep, settled certainty of someone who has put her body into the truth and felt the truth hold her weight. This is an earth-sheltered dwelling, she said. a permanent residence constructed using techniques adapted from established mining ventilation and structural engineering. It contains a fireplace, a bed storage shelving, a timber-framed interior, and access to a natural water source. Her voice was steady, not loud, not aggressive, but clear in the way that truth is clear when it doesn't need decoration. I am not mining. I have never mined. I am building a home on land that my husband registered that I inherited legally upon his death and that I have improved through my own labor. The Homestead Act recognizes the right of citizens to develop land for residential purposes. What I've built serves that purpose. Nothing about the original registration changes what stands on that ground today. Whitfield studied his plans. His face gave nothing away. The categorization of the land was established at the time of registration. The law does not allow retroactive reclassification based on subsequent use. Then the law should see what's actually there before deciding what it means. A murmur through the room. Ellie held her ground. And then Wade Harlan stood up. Nobody expected it, least of all Ellie. Harlan was not a man given to public gestures. He conducted his business, quietly paid his debts on time, attended church when the weather permitted, and generally kept his opinions inside the fence line of his own ranch. But he stood and the room turned. Your Honor, I've been inside that structure. His voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being listened to. It's a home, there's a bed in there, a fireplace that works better than mine, and I built mine with a professional mason. There are shelves with provisions, a floor laid clean, walls shored up with timber that would pass inspection in any mine in the territory. He paused. If that's a mine, then my ranch house is a cathedral. Laughter quickly suppressed. Whitfield's jaw tightened. And then a second person stood. Ruth Adler in the back row, rising to her feet with the visible effort of a woman overcoming something heavier than gravity. Ruth was 45. She had run the general store alone since her husband's death 8 years ago. She had never spoken at a public proceeding. She had never contradicted a man in authority. She had survived by being agreeable, by being useful, by being the kind of woman that men described as sensible when they meant obedient. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and she gripped the back of the chair in front of her to steady them. I'd like to say something, Your Honor. Her voice shook on the first sentence, then steadied. Eleanor Dawson has been buying supplies from my store since spring. Lamp oil, fabric, nails, cooking utensils. Not a single item related to mining. Not dynamite, not drilling equipment, not assay supplies. She has been buying the materials of a household because that is what she is building. The room was silent. Ruth sat down. Her hands were still trembling, but her back was straight. Whitfield looked at the Helena clerk. The clerk looked at his papers. A long, difficult silence filled the room like water filling a low place, finding every crack and gap. This court will defer its ruling for 90 days, Whitfield said finally. His voice was even controlled, but Ellie could hear the machinery working behind it, the recalculation of a man whose equation had just gained new variables. To allow for further documentation of land use and consultation with the territorial office, the current occupant may continue residence pending final determination. He gathered his papers, straightened them, tapped them into alignment. Then he looked at Ellie, and for the first time his expression contained something that wasn't legal or procedural. Something human and uncertain, like a man looking at a map and realizing the territory doesn't match. 90 days, Mrs. Dawson. The room exhaled. Chairs scraped. People stood and gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices the way people speak after witnessing something they'll need time to understand. Agnes Pruitt caught Ellie's eye as she gathered her plans from the table. Agnes opened her mouth closed. It looked down at her hands. The woman who had told every family within 10 miles about the crazy widow's hole now found herself without words. It was, Ellie thought, the first time that had ever happened. Henrik Pruitt was already at the door, his hat pulled low, moving with the speed of a man who wants to leave before anyone asks him about his $40 offer for land that had just been defended by the most powerful rancher in the valley. Billy Fenton caught Ellie at the bottom of the stairs. That was something, he said, his young face flushed with the excitement of someone who has just watched the rules of his world rearrange themselves. Mr. Harlan standing up like that, and Mrs. Adler. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody sees most things coming, Billy. That's the whole problem. She left the courtroom and stood at the top of the exterior staircase, breathing cold November air, looking out at the town that had gossiped about her and the mountains beyond that wanted to kill her. 90 days carried her through winter. Whatever Helena decided, whatever Whitfield eventually ruled, she would have the coldest months inside her shelter, warm, safe, alive. Ruth Adler found her there. "I don't know why I stood up," Ruth said. She was hugging herself against the cold, but the trembling in her hands had stopped. "My hands were shaking the whole time." "You stood up because you knew what was right." Ruth laughed, a short, surprised sound. "I've known what was right for 8 years. Today was the first time I acted on it." She looked at Ellie with an expression that contained admiration and something else. Envy, perhaps. The particular envy of someone who recognizes courage and understands exactly how much of it they've been lacking. "What are you going to do now?" "Same thing I've been doing. Keep digging." Ruth nodded, and something shifted between them, a quiet rearrangement of two lives that had been running parallel and now without announcement or ceremony converged. Through November, the shelter became a home. Ellie hung bundles of pine branches from the ceiling, beams for their clean scent and the mild antiseptic properties of the resin. She wove rugs from fabric scraps and placed them on the plank floor, adding color to the earth-toned space. She moved her books in the small collection that had survived Thomas's debts, 7 volumes that she arranged on the shelf nearest the bed, copper pots on hooks near the fireplace. A mirror salvaged from the cabin hung where it caught lamplight and doubled it. Rusty claimed his spot immediately, a worn blanket beside the fireplace where he could watch both the flames and the tunnel entrance. He seemed to understand that this place was different from the cabin, that his human had built something that deserved guarding. It was a Tuesday evening in the middle of November when Dalton didn't show up. He'd been coming every other day, reliable by his standards, working on finished details inside the shelter. The door frame needed reinforcing. The water basin at the rear of the chamber, where groundwater seeped through a crack in the rock and collected in a hollow Ellie had carved and lined with stone, needed a drainage channel to prevent overflow. Small tasks, but tasks that required the kind of precision that Dalton, when sober, possessed in abundance. He didn't come Tuesday, didn't come Wednesday. On Thursday evening, Ellie walked the 3 miles to town, something she rarely did, and found him at the back table of the only saloon, surrounded by empty glasses, in the particular silence that gathers around a man who is drinking not for pleasure but for erasure. His eyes were red, not from smoke. "Today's Lily's birthday," he said when he saw her. "She'd be 5. Ellie sat down across from him. She didn't take the drink from his hand, didn't lecture, didn't offer comfort in words, because there were no words for this, and they both knew it. "Come on," she said after a while. "I'll walk you home." They walked through the cold dark, their breath-making clouds that dissolved into the stars. Halfway back, Dalton stopped walking and said something that landed in Ellie's chest like a stone thrown through a window. "You're building yourself a shelter. Good for you. But what are you sheltering from, Ellie? From winter? Or from the fact that you're just as alone as I am and you're afraid to admit it?" She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the question had teeth, and they were sinking into something she'd been keeping buried deeper than any tunnel. They walked the rest of the way in silence. At the fork where the trail split toward his rented room above the feed store in her hillside, Dalton stopped. He swayed slightly, but his eyes were focused, the whiskey having burned through to something raw and honest underneath. "I'm sorry," he said. "That wasn't fair." "Fair doesn't matter. The question matters." He looked at her for a long moment, the moonlight turning his face into a study of shadow and bone. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think it can be both. You can be running from something and building towards something at the same time. That's what most people are doing. They just don't have the guts to pick up a pickaxe while they do it." He turned and walked toward town, his footsteps uneven on the frozen ground. Ellie watched until he disappeared, then followed the trail back to the hillside, Rusty trotting ahead, his breath making small clouds that caught the starlight and vanished. That night, alone in the shelter that was almost finished, she sat beside the unlit fireplace and let the question do its work. Was she building this because it was smart? Or because she couldn't stand the emptiness of the cabin, where Thomas's absence filled every corner like smoke? Was it survival or escape? And in the silence, with Rusty's breathing, the only sound, she found herself traveling backward to a place she'd been avoiding. Not to Thomas's warmth, which she'd already mourned. Not to the morning he left, which she'd already regretted. But to their last argument. The night before he went to check the traps she'd told him not to go. The snow was too deep. The trails would be icy. He could check them in a week when conditions improved. Thomas had smiled. "You worry too much, Ellie. I've walked that ridge 100 times. She hadn't pushed, hadn't insisted, hadn't stood in the doorway and said, "No, you are not going." Not tomorrow, not in this weather, not while I'm alive and to stop you. She'd let him kiss her forehead and say goodnight, and in the morning he was gone, before she woke his side of the bed still warm, his boots missing from beside the door. She should have held him back. She should have been the immovable object that his unstoppable stubbornness crashed against. She should have fought for him the way she was fighting for this shelter with every ounce of will she possessed. I should have kept you home, Thomas, she whispered into the dark. Rusty lifted his head, looked at her, put his head back down. She didn't sleep that night, but when morning came gray and cold, she built a fire in the fireplace and watched the smoke rise through the chimney and curl out of the hillside above. The fire worked. The chimney drew. The warmth spread through the chamber in slow, steady waves, pushing the coal back into the walls where it belonged. Whatever her reasons for building this place, the warmth was real. The shelter was real. And real things didn't need justification. They just needed to exist. She moved in on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. She carried her bedding, her cookware, her books, and her dog through the tunnel entrance and closed the heavy oak door behind her against the wind. The fire was already burning. The chamber held its warmth the way a cupped hand holds water completely without leaking. She slept that night more deeply than she had since April. Rusty curled at the foot of the bed. The wind screamed above, impotent, unable to reach them. And somewhere in her dreams, she heard Thomas laugh, not cruelly, not dismissively, but with the surprised delight of a man who has been proven wrong about something wonderful. December passed in quiet industry. Ellie improved the shelter daily, fine-tuned the draft of the fireplace, built a small grate over the fire pit for cooking, carved a second shelf above the bed for the books she read by lamplight during the long evenings. Ruth Adler brought supplies from town once a week now, carrying them on her own back because she didn't own a horse walking 6 miles round trip through increasingly hostile weather, because she had decided that being useful to Eleanor Dawson was more important than being comfortable. They didn't discuss this. Ruth arrived, delivered goods, drank a cup of coffee in the shelter, and walked home. The friendship, if that's what it was, operated on the currency of action rather than words. On one of those visits, near the end of December, Ruth sat longer than usual. She held her coffee cup with both hands and stared at the fire with an expression that Ellie recognized because she'd seen it in her own reflection. The look of a woman taking inventory of her life and finding the shelves emptier than expected. My husband used to say I was the careful one, Ruth said. He was the dreamer, I was the planner. After he died, I kept planned myself right into a box. Careful with the money, careful with the store, careful with what I said and who I said it to. She took a sip. Turns out you can be so careful you forget to actually live. Ellie said nothing. Some confessions need silence the way seeds need soil. What you did, Ruth continued, standing up in that courtroom building this place while everyone told you not to. That's not reckless. That's the opposite of reckless. That's deciding what matters and refusing to let anyone take it from you. She set her cup down. I want to learn how to do that. You already did, Ellie said. You stood up at that hearing. Nobody made you. Nobody asked you. Ruth considered this. Then she nodded, once pulled her coat tight, and walked back into the cold. But she walked differently than she had arrived. Straighter, as if something that had been pressing down on her shoulders for 8 years had shifted just enough to let her breathe. January came with false gentleness. The first week was mild by Montana standards, temperatures hovering near 20 degrees, sunshine pale, but present wind restrained. Old Jenkins, the prospector, who had survived more winters in the mountains than anyone else in the valley, stopped by on the afternoon of January 5th. He sat at Ellie's table, drank her coffee, and said very little. But when he stood to leave, his face carried an expression she hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly. Wariness. The deep cellular wariness of an animal that smells something wrong on the wind. 40 years up in those mountains, he said from the doorway. Never seen weather patterns like this. Warm when it should be pressure dropping when it should be steady. Something's building up there, Eleanor, and when it comes down, it won't be ordinary. He pulled his collar up and stepped into the fading light. Then he turned back. If it comes, I'll look for your smoke. She watched him go. Then she went inside and counted her supplies. Firewood stacked along one wall, the spring at the back of the chamber dripping steadily. Dried meat, preserved vegetables, beans, flour, salt, sugar, coffee. Enough for one person for a month. She didn't know it yet, but she would need every ounce of it, and it wouldn't be enough. The blizzard struck on January 7th, 1888. It would later be called the schoolhouse blizzard, the children's blizzard, the storm that changed the definition of what weather could do to a civilization that thought it had already survived the worst. It would kill more than 300 people across the northern territories, many of them children caught between school and home when a warm January afternoon turned in the space of minutes into a howling white apocalypse. Ellie experienced the storm's arrival as a sound, a low moan that built from the north, rising in pitch and volume until it became a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from above and below, and inside the walls, a sound so immense that it stopped being sound and became pressure, became weight, became a physical force that pressed against the oak door of her shelter like a living thing demanding entry. She fed the fire. She lit the lamp. She sat in the chair she'd built from salvaged lumber and opened a book, and she read while the world above tried to tear itself apart. The temperature outside plummeted. She couldn't see a thermometer, but she could feel it in the quality of the cold that seeped around the doorframe, a cold so intense it seemed to have texture, seemed to crackle at the edges like something crystallizing. Inside the chamber held steady, the fire burned. The earth wrapped around her like a fist that refused to open. She cooked, she slept. She talked to Rusty about everything and nothing, the sound of her own voice a lantern held against the darkness of isolation. She lost track of time in the unchanging lamplight of her underground world. On the third morning, or what she believed was morning, she heard something that wasn't wind. Pounding. At her door, rhythmic, desperate, human. She reached for the rifle Thomas had left above the mantel, approached the door, pressed her ear against the oak, and heard beneath the howling a voice so thin and broken it barely qualified as sound. "Please, we saw the smoke from your chimney. Please let us in." Ellie opened the door and the storm tried to follow. 3 figures stood in the entrance tunnel, so encased in snow and ice that they had stopped looking human and started looking like something the earth itself had formed and then rejected. 2 adults, a child between them, clutched in forearms, motionless. Behind them, the world had been erased. A wall of white so dense and absolute that it wasn't weather anymore. It was obliteration. And the child was not moving. "Get inside now." Ellie seized the nearest figure by the arm and pulled. The body was stiff, resisting not from will but from cold, the muscles locked beneath layers of frozen clothing that had become armor against movement rather than protection against weather. The second adult stumbled forward, and between them the child hung suspended, arms locked around her mother's neck, face buried silent. They collapsed on the plank floor, and the door swung shut behind them, but not before the storm reached inside and raked the chamber with a blast that dropped the temperature 10 degrees in 3 seconds. Ellie threw her weight against the oak, and the wind screamed through the narrowing gap until the latch caught, and silence, relative silence, returned. Not silence, shaking. 3 bodies on her floor, convulsing so violently that the planks rattled against the packed earth beneath. The man's teeth chattered with a sound like gravel being shaken in a tin cup. The woman made no sound at all, her eyes squeezed shut, her arms locked around the child, her lips the color of a bruise 3 days old. The child. Ellie knelt. The girl was perhaps 6, her face white, her eyes closed, her body motionless against her mother's chest. No shaking, no shivering. That was worse. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Stillness meant it had started to give up. Ellie placed her hand on the child's cheek. Cold, but not the cold of death. Not yet. The skin had a faint resilience, the barest trace of warmth beneath the frozen surface, a candle flame seen through heavy fog. Then the girl's eyes opened, slowly unfocused, traveling across the ceiling beams until they found the fire. And she made a sound that Ellie would remember for the rest of her life, a sound that was neither cry nor word, but something older than language. The sound of a creature recognizing safety after believing safety no longer existed. Ellie worked with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed a crisis in her mind without knowing she was rehearsing it. Blankets first stripped from her own bed, hot water from the kettle she kept simmering on the grate, then broth warm and salted spooned into mouths too frozen to chew. She peeled away their outer clothing, the coats and scarves that had become shells of ice, and replaced them with quilts and dry wool wrapping, each body the way you wrap a wound tight and complete. 6 hours passed before any of them could form words. "The wind took our roof," the woman's voice was raw, scraped hollow. "Just peeled it off. The walls came down after that." She was Mrs. Caldwell. Her husband slumped against the wall with his hands held out toward the fire, His fingers waxy and pale, was Mr. Caldwell. The child was Emma. "We saw your smoke," Mr. Caldwell said. His voice cracked on the second word. "Didn't know where else to go. Everyone else was too far. We never would have made it anywhere else." "How did you know about this place?" Mr. Caldwell tried to smile. The expression managed only a brief appearance before exhaustion pulled it under. "Everyone knows about the widow who dug herself into a mountain." He paused. "Doesn't seem so crazy anymore." Ellie looked at her shelter. 12 by 10 feet, built for one woman and one dog. Now holding 5 living creatures, 3 of whom had been minutes from death. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." The Caldwells were the first. They were not the last. Billy Fenton arrived on the second morning for crawling through the tunnel on his hands and knees because he no longer had the strength to walk upright. 19 years old, separated from a search party, looking for lost cattle, lost himself for 11 hours in conditions that should have killed him in 3. He had survived by following the contour of the hillside, moving not toward any destination, but simply away from the open ground where the wind hit hardest until the faint smell of wood smoke reached him through the whiteout, and he crawled toward it with the last strength in his arms. He didn't speak when he came through the door. He sat against the wall, pulled his knees to his chest, and stared at the fire with eyes that had seen the inside of something that people were not supposed to see and survive. Old Jenkins arrived an hour later. 2 miles through whiteout, guided by smoke, he couldn't see but could smell the way a man who has spent 40 years in mountains trusts his nose more than his eyes. He ducked through the entrance, brushed snow from his shoulders, looked around at the 5 people already crowding the chamber, and said, "Warm in here." Then he sat down, accepted a cup of coffee, and didn't say another word for 4 hours. Sarah Lowe came next in the early afternoon, carrying her infant son Michael inside her coat, pressed against her chest, kept alive by the heat of her own body, because every other source of heat had failed. Her farmhouse had gone cold when the fire died and wouldn't relight the stovepipe choked with ice, the matches too damp, the kindling frozen solid. She had wrapped Michael in 4 blankets, then wrapped herself around the blankets and walked into the storm because staying meant watching her son freeze. She hadn't known about the shelter. She had simply walked towards smoke. When Ellie opened the door, Sarah fell forward into the chamber and didn't get up. Ellie lifted Michael from inside the coat. A terrible second of silence. Then the baby screamed a furious, red-faced howl that filled the underground room with the most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. The sound of a life that refused to end. 8 people now, 1 dog, 1 infant, in a space built for one. They arranged themselves the way water arranges itself in a container, filling every available space, adjusting to each other's shapes. The Caldwells claimed the area nearest the fire, Emma between them. Sarah and Michael took the corner beside the fireplace where the warmth was most concentrated. Jenkins sat by the door, his back against the frame, a position that seemed casual but that Ellie recognized as strategic. He was the oldest, the most experienced, and he had placed himself at the point of greatest vulnerability without being asked. Billy Fenton sat in the opposite corner, his knees drawn up, his face turned away from the others. After an hour, Ellie noticed his shoulders moving in a rhythm that wasn't shivering. He was weeping. Silently, privately, the way young men weep when they discover that the world can kill them, and almost did. She brought him a blanket, didn't say anything, didn't touch his shoulder or tell him it would be all right. Just placed the blanket over his knees and went back to the fire. Sometimes the only kindness that doesn't humiliate is the kind that pretends not to notice. The hours stretched. Jenkins, when he finally spoke, told stories. Winter survival tales from his decades in the mountains, each one more improbable than the last. A January he'd spent in a hollow log. A blizzard he'd outlasted in a buffalo carcass. A night he'd kept his feet from freezing by burying them in the warm ashes of a dead campfire. Ellie suspected he was embellishing, stretching the truth the way you stretch dough, adding air to make it larger. But it didn't matter. The stories gave people something to listen to besides the wind and their own fear, and that was worth more than accuracy. Sarah sang to Michael in the warm corner. A lullaby in a language Ellie didn't recognize, something soft and repetitive, the musical equivalent of a heartbeat. Michael slept through most of the storm, ate when offered, cried when hungry, and existed in the uncomplicated present tense of an 8-month-old who had no concept of what was happening beyond the boundaries of his mother's arms. Emma Caldwell stopped shaking by the second day, but she would not release her mother's hand. Not to eat, not to sleep, not for any reason. Her fingers stayed locked around her mother's, and her eyes, which had seen their house torn apart around them, stayed fixed on the fire, as if willing it never to go out. Night fell, or Ellie thought it did. Time had become abstract, measured not by light and dark, but by the burning rate of oil in the lamp and the slowly descending level of the firewood stack against the wall. She was calculating how many days of fuel remained when the pounding came. Heavy, urgent, different from the Caldwell's desperate knocking. This was the sound of a large man hitting wood with the flat of his hand. She opened the door and Dalton Schaefer fell through it, half frozen and wild-eyed, dragging behind him a body that wasn't moving. Found him on the main road, Dalton gasped. His face was crusted with ice, his eyebrows white, his lips cracked and bleeding. Carriage overturned, horse dead. He was crawling. Ellie looked at the man on the floor. Tall, thin, dark vest over a white shirt now torn and soaked. A face she recognized, though it took a moment, because she had never seen it without its careful composition, its measured expressions, its architectural certainty. Judge Horace Whitfield lay on the floor of Eleanor Dawson's underground shelter. Unconscious, his fingers the color of candle wax, his breathing shallow and irregular. His life held in the hands of the woman whose land he had tried to take. The room went still. Everyone knew. The Caldwells knew. Jenkins knew. Billy Fenton, who had stopped crying and was watching from his corner, knew. They all knew who this man was and what he had tried to do, and they all looked at Ellie and waited. She looked at Whitfield, at his white fingers, at his blue lips, at the shallow rise and fall of his chest, each breath a negotiation between life and the cold that was trying to end it. She looked at him the way she had looked at Emma Caldwell 2 days ago, assessing not history or grievance, but the simple, urgent arithmetic of survival. Put him by the fire. Dalton lifted Whitfield and carried him to the warmth. Ellie wrapped him the same way she'd wrapped the others. Blankets, hot water, broth spooned between lips that could barely part. The same hands that had dug the shelter Whitfield tried to destroy now worked to keep him alive inside it. Nobody spoke about this. Nobody needed to. Dalton, after laying Whitfield down, slid to the floor against the far wall and sat breathing hard, his chest heaving, his frozen coat cracking as he moved. Ellie brought him water. "You came to find me," she said, not a question. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." He drank. "Found him on the way. You could have left him." Dalton looked at her. "So could you. 10 people. 1 dog, 1 infant, in a space built for 1. They slept in shifts, 3 or 4 at a time on the bed and floor, while others sat against the walls. Ellie kept the fire burning around the clock, feeding it with measured portions of wood, rationing the fuel, the way a captain rations water on a becalmed ship. Dalton took the night watch, positioning himself at the door with a blanket over his shoulders and his eyes open. "Why won't you sleep?" Ellie asked him during the second night, when the others were down and the fire had settled into a low, steady burn. "When Margaret and Lily were sick, I slept. Every night. They were dying in the next room, and I slept because the doctor said there was nothing I could do, and I believed him." He adjusted the blanket. "Tonight there are people who need protecting. I can stay awake for that." On the third day, Ellie counted the remaining supplies and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settle into her stomach. The flour was enough for 2 more days of thin porridge. The dried meat was gone. The beans could stretch to 1 more meal if she thinned them with water. Coffee was nearly out, and while coffee wasn't survival, it was morale, and morale was the only thing keeping several of these people from coming apart. She said nothing to the group, but Dalton saw her counting. Their eyes met across the dim room, and the conversation happened in silence. "How long?" he murmured that evening, while Jenkins told a story loud enough to cover whispered words. 2 days, maybe 3 if we cut portions now." He nodded. "Then we cut portions now. Tell them it's easier on the body to eat light when you're recovering from cold exposure." It wasn't true, and they both knew but it was plausible, and plausibility was all they needed. Jenkins knew too. Ellie saw him watching her divide the portions, saw the calculation in his old eyes, the understanding that comes from decades of experience with deprivation. He said nothing, but when his portion was served, he ate half, then held the rest out to Emma Caldwell. "My stomach's not what it used to be," he said. "Can't handle a full meal anymore." Emma took the food. Jenkins caught Ellie's eye, and between them passed an acknowledgement that required no words. The old protect the young. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Whitfield regained consciousness 8 hours after Dalton carried him in. He opened his eyes slowly, the way a man surfaces from deep water, ascending through layers of confusion before breaking into clarity. He looked at the ceiling beams, the earthen walls, the fire, the circle of faces watching him, and then Ellie kneeling beside him with a cup of warm water. He knew where he was. She could see the recognition arrive, could see it move through his face the way weather moves across a landscape, changing everything it touches. He looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was barely audible. "Why?" "Because this is my home," Ellie said. "And in my home, nobody freezes to death." Whitfield closed his eyes. A line of moisture tracked down his temple. He didn't wipe it away. Through the hours that followed, Whitfield said almost nothing. But he watched. He watched Ellie distribute the dwindling food with absolute fairness, each person receiving exactly the same amount regardless of who they were or what they had done. He watched her check Mr. Caldwell's fingers, gently manipulating the joints to maintain circulation. He watched her calm Emma with a story about Rusty as a puppy, inventing details that made the girl smile for the first time in 3 days. He watched her do what she had always done, the thing that had driven her to pick up a pickaxe and swing it into a hillside while the whole valley called her crazy. She took care of things. She built what was needed. She kept people warm. Late on the third night, he spoke again, quietly only to Ellie while the others slept or pretended to. "My house in town lost its roof the first day. Tin sheets peeled right off. I left for Helena because I thought the road south would be safer than staying." The admission hung in the air between them. The man who had told Ellie that a woman alone shouldn't stay out here before winter, that she should sell her land and move to town, had nearly died because he fled town in a carriage, while the woman he'd tried to displace survived in the shelter he'd tried to demolish. Ellie poured him more water. "Drink this. You need fluids." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The shelter said it for her. The warmth said it. The 10 people breathing inside a hillside while 300 others died in the white emptiness above said everything that words would only diminish. The wind stopped on the morning of January 10th. Ellie knew it had stopped because she woke to silence, and silence after 3 days of unbroken roaring was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She lay still for a moment, listening to the absence, then rose and walked to the door. She opened it onto a world she didn't recognize. The snow was drifted 15 feet high in places, sculpted by 3 days of wind into formations that looked designed rather than natural, as if the storm had been an artist working in a medium that only existed for the duration of its fury. The sky was blue deeply, almost violently blue, the specific blue that follows catastrophe, beautiful and indifferent. One by one, her refugees emerged. They stepped into the sunlight and stood blinking, breathing, looking at what the storm had done to the world they remembered. "My God," whispered Mr. Caldwell. Nobody else spoke. There was nothing to say that the landscape wasn't already saying. Whitfield was the last to leave. He stood at the entrance, dressed in the dry clothes Ellie had given him, his recovered coat brushed clean. He didn't look at her at first. He looked at the valley, at the buried fences, and the shapeless drifts where houses should have been visible and weren't. Then he turned. "The case will be dismissed, Mrs. Dawson. I'll reclassify the land myself. Residential use, not mining claim." His voice had its old precision, but underneath it, something had shifted in the way foundation stones shift after a flood still in place, but rearranged at angles that change everything built on top of them. 10 people survived in there. That's evidence no court in the territory would overturn. Ellie nodded. "Thank you, Judge." "Don't thank me. I'm applying the law to the facts." The facts changed. He stepped into the snow, then he stopped without turning around. "I would have frozen on that road. You need to know I understand that." He walked away. His footprints in the fresh snow were the first marks on a surface that was otherwise untouched, a page that the blizzard had wiped clean for the world to write on again. Dalton watched him go. "Do you believe him?" Ellie considered. "I believe he believes in the law, and the law says I'm right now. That's enough." The weeks that followed were a reckoning. The valley dug itself out and counted its dead. Frozen bodies found in drifts. Collapsed houses with families still inside discovered when neighbors came to check on them days too late. Children who had left school when the warm afternoon turned murderous and never reached home. Their small bodies found along roads and in fields, some of them within sight of their own front doors. More than 300 dead across the territories. The number was staggering, but numbers don't carry grief the way names do. And in a small valley in Montana, though names were known. The Marsh family, all 4 of them, found in their house with the fire burned to nothing. Tom Reeves, 17, discovered half a mile from the school he had been walking home from. Infant twins born to a family 2 valleys over, dead in their cradle, when the parents couldn't keep the house warm enough to sustain lives that new and small. Ellie's shelter had held 10 people through the worst of it. The story spread the way fire spreads through dry grass fast and impossible to contain. The newspapers picked it up. The territorial governor mentioned it in a speech. Strangers began appearing at the claim wanting to see the underground home that had saved 10 lives. But before the fame, before the speeches, before any of that, there were the small things that mattered more. One week after the blizzard, Ellie and Dalton dug through the snow to the ruins of the Caldwell farmhouse. The roof was gone, the walls caved inward, the contents scattered and buried. They worked for hours with shovels, not looking for valuables, but for one specific item that Mrs. Caldwell had wept about losing. A tin box, the kind you buy at a general store for 50 cents, containing photographs. The family portrait taken the year Emma was born. Mr. Caldwell's parents, dead now, preserved in silver and paper. They found it under a fallen beam, dented but intact. When Ellie brought it to the Caldwells, who were staying with neighbors until they could rebuild, Emma took out the family portrait and held it against her chest. And for the first time since the night her house came apart around her, she let go of her mother's hand. Billy Fenton came back to the shelter the following week, not because he needed warmth or food, but because he couldn't sleep. Every time the wind picked up, every time a board creaked, he was back in the whiteout, crawling through snow that wanted to swallow him, breathing air that cut his lungs, certain that every direction led to death. He sat in the shelter for an afternoon. Ellie didn't ask him to talk, didn't offer advice, just let him sit in the warmth and the quiet and the absolute safety of a space that the worst storm in living memory had failed to breach. He left calmer. He came back twice more before the nightmares faded. He never explained, and she never asked. Spring came late that year, as if even the seasons were reluctant to follow the winter of 1888. But it came, and with it Ruth Adler walked up the hill carrying a leather-bound notebook filled with handwriting that wasn't hers. "I've been writing down everything you told me," she said, "about the construction, the techniques, how to choose a site, how to evaluate the soil, how to shore properly. I think you should teach." "Teach? You saved 10 lives, Ellie. Other people need to know how to save their own." The first class had 17 students, farmers who had lost barns, ranchers who had lost livestock, townspeople who had lost family members and sworn with the desperate conviction of the bereaved that they would never be that vulnerable again. They came with notebooks and questions and the specific humility of people who have been proven wrong about something important. Ellie taught them everything. Dalton stood beside her, demonstrating the physical techniques, translating her knowledge of principles into the practical language of hands and tools. When an older student named Howard Marsh, who had lost his wife in the blizzard and now lived alone in a silence he couldn't bear, struggled with his first excavation, his hands trembling too badly to control the pickaxe, Dalton stood beside him and said quietly, "Tilt your swing 15 degrees. Let the weight do the work." The same words he'd said to Ellie on the first day. Ellie heard them and felt something move in her chest, a recognition that things were beginning to circle back. That knowledge was traveling the way it was supposed to travel, outward from one person to the next, each hand passing it to another hand, each voice carrying it further from its origin. By autumn, 8 new shelters stood in the valley. By the following spring, 20. Within 5 years, the technique had spread across the northern territories, adapted and modified for different conditions. A Swedish immigrant named Lindquist improved the ventilation to handle humid climates. A former Army engineer drafted standardized plans that inexperienced builders could follow. A group of Blackfeet craftsmen combined Ellie's principles with their own traditional knowledge, creating structures better suited to the specific conditions of their homeland. Ellie welcomed all of it. She visited the new shelters when she could, learning from innovations that others had made, folding those improvements back into her teaching. "Knowledge isn't like gold," she told her students. "Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Every person who learns from me and teaches someone else makes the whole community stronger." She never charged for the teaching. She accepted what people offered. Firewood, food, labor on projects she couldn't complete alone. But the knowledge itself she gave away freely. It seemed wrong to do otherwise. Dalton stopped drinking. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no announcement, no declaration, no moment of crisis and resolution. One day, Ellie simply noticed that he didn't smell of whiskey anymore, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time he had. She didn't comment, he didn't explain. Some changes are too important for the smallness of words. He continued helping build shelters for others using the skills of 12 years in the mines for something that mattered more than pulling minerals out of the ground. When someone asked him why he worked for free, he said only, "I owe somebody." He never specified who. Maybe Margaret, maybe Lily, maybe Ellie, maybe all of them, maybe himself. It was years later on a summer evening that Wade Harlan rode up to the shelter and sat on his horse looking at the entrance the way he had on the first day, except that everything about his expression was different. "You could have been rich, you know," he said. "Patented the design, charged licensing fees, built yourself an empire." Ellie was sitting at the entrance of her shelter, watching the sunset turn the mountains the color of honey. Rusty lay at her feet, old now gray, around the muzzle, his breathing slow and measured, his eyes half closed, in the particular contentment of a dog who has spent his entire life with one person and found it sufficient. He had been there from the beginning, had watched her dig the first shovelful of dirt, had been the first living creature to sleep warm inside the shelter that would save so many lives. He was special in the way that first witnesses are always special, the ones who see the beginning and carry it inside them. "I'm already rich," Ellie said. "I have a home that keeps me warm. I have work that matters. I have a dog who loves me and neighbors who respect me." She looked at Harlan with the same steady gaze she'd given him on the first day, except that now there was no defiance in it, only the settled certainty of a woman who had argued with the world and won. What else does a woman need? Harlan had no answer for that. That night after he'd gone, Ellie sat by the fire with Rusty's head on her lap and thought about Thomas one last time. Not with grief which had softened over the years into something quieter and more manageable. Not with guilt, which she had finally set down, the way you set down a stone you have been carrying so long, you forgot it wasn't part of your body. She thought about him with something new. Gratitude. He had been wrong about many things. Wrong about the traps, wrong about the ravine, wrong about moles and about people and about where safety could be found. But he had been right about one thing, most important thing. He had brought her here, to this hillside, this valley, this particular patch of earth that held the clay, that held the shape, that held the heat, that held 10 lives on the worst night in territorial history. Without Thomas, she would never have come to Montana, would never have stood on this hill, would never have swung a pickaxe into the ground and found beneath the rock and root and pain a home. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, and she meant it for everything. For the love and the law and the cabin that leaked, and the land nobody wanted, and the life that had broken her open so that something new could grow in the breaking. Rusty's tail moved once, a single slow sweep against the floor. Then he slept, and she slept, and the fire burned on. Eleanor Dawson lived in her underground shelter for another 37 years. She died in the winter of 1924 at the age of 68 in her sleep in the bed she had built with her own hands in the room she had carved from a hillside while the whole world told her she was wrong. She died warm. Rusty had been gone for many years by then. She had buried him at the top of the hill in a small grave beside the chimney vent where the smoke from her fire rose and dissolved into the mountain air. She'd gotten other dogs after him, had loved them and lost them and loved again, because that was what you did with love. You didn't bury it with the dead. You gave it to the next living thing that needed it. But Rusty had been first. Rusty had been there when it was just a woman and a pickaxe and a hill that didn't want to open. And in Ellie's heart, he never left that spot beside the fireplace, watching the flames, watching the door, waiting for whatever came next, with the unshakable faith of a creature who had decided long ago that his person knew what she was doing. She was buried beside him at her own request. The grave marker was simple, cut from local stone by a mason who had been one of her students. Eleanor Dawson, 1856 to 1924. She dug deep and found warmth. The shelter still stands today. The Historical Society maintains it, replacing timber as it ages, keeping the entrance clear, preserving the chamber exactly as Ellie left it. Visitors can walk through the entrance tunnel, duck through the timber-framed doorway, and stand in the oval room where 10 people survived the worst blizzard in territorial history. The fireplace still works. The spring still seeps through its crack in the rock and collects in the basin she carved more than a century ago. The earthen walls still hold their temperature steady and unchanging while the seasons rage and relent above. The guides tell her story to every group that passes through. They explain the engineering and the history, the woman who was mocked for digging a hole and ended up saving a community. But the part that visitors carry with them, when they leave the part they tell their children about the part that settles into them, the way warmth settles into cold hands, is simpler than engineering or history. It is the story of a woman who lost everything and chose to build something new. A woman who listened to her own knowing when everyone else's certainty had failed. A woman who swung a pickaxe into a hillside while the neighbors laughed and the law threatened and the winter sharpened itself on the mountains above. They told her she was digging her own grave. They told her she was crazy foolish, wasting her time on something that would collapse around her. She kept digging anyway. And when the storm came, the storm that killed hundreds, that buried houses and froze cattle, and turned the open prairie into a place where the living envied the dead, she was warm. She was safe. She was alive. And so were the 10 people who found their way to her door, drawn by the smoke rising from a hillside, the only sign of life in a world that had surrendered to the cold. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But Eleanor Dawson knew, she had always known, the surface world is hostile, unpredictable, deadly. But dig deep enough past the rock and the roots and the fear and the grief, and you find something the surface cannot touch. You find warmth, you find shelter, you find home. All you have to do is keep swinging.